In this lecture, I'm going to offer an overview of some of the important strands of early modern philosophical thought about the nature of normativity that culminate in Kant's autonomy model as Hegel weaves together in his own metaphysical understanding of normativity in the social terms of reciprocal recognition. Hegel himself doesn't offer a rational reconstruction of this sort of the tradition that he inherited and developed. But here, I think seeing what he picks up as progressive and what he treats as remnants of ossified pre-modern forms of understanding offers an illuminating perspective on his own metaphysics of normativity, which is at once firmly rooted in previous thinking and radically innovative. My model here is Jerry Schneewind's magisterial book, The Invention of Autonomy, which looks back at much of the same tradition through the lens of what Kant made of it. And I think of myself as doing the same thing Schneewind was doing, but looking back through the lens of what Hegel made of it. And they picked up rather different strands. Hegel sees all subsequent forms of understanding as developing from the rejection of the traditional metaphysics of normativity that I call the subordination obedience model. He addresses it to begin with in the allegory of the master and the servant, Herr and Knecht. The distinguishing feature of this model is that the paradigmatic normative status, obligation, is taken to be instituted by the command of a superior. As an explicit metaphysics of normativity, the origins of the theories of this sort is in theology, in a picture of God as the ultimate legislator, whose commands institute laws that his creatures are obliged to obey. The voluntarist wing of Catholic natural law theory, represented by Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, gave rise to Protestant natural law theorists who to one extent or another secularized and naturalized this approach. The idea of superior-subordinate relationships as part of the objective order of things is the core of the Neoplatonic great chain of being, the Scala Naturae, deriving from Plotinus. This great hierarchical structure traces down from God at the top through the ranks of angelic beings catalogued by Aquinas, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, and dominations at the superior end, down to the lowly archangels and angels at the subordinate end, and then down through a human hierarchy with kings at the top as superior to various kinds of nobles who stand in the same relation to different estates of less well-born commoners, continuing even to rankings of animals, plants, and minerals according to their metaphysical primacy. This picture of relations of subordination is not only matters of objective fact, but is in some sense the fundamental objective metaphysical structure of reality, invited early modern theorists to naturalize such relations, to bring them back down to earth. The status of being a superior is, on the obedience model itself, a normatively significant status. It entails the right or the authority to legislate, to institute obligations, to command obedience. But on these reductive accounts, possession of that status relative to others is itself a non-normative matter of objective fact, a matter of one's power, paradigmatically one's power to compel obedience or punish disobedience, or of the matter of factual dependence of the subordinates on the superior, for instance, in having been created by the superior. The concept of the relative status of superior-subordinate is construed as having non-normative circumstances of appropriate application, but normative consequences of application, in that the commands of the superior institute normative statuses of obligation on those related to them as subordinates. Pufendorf and Cumberland introduced two rising themes challenging the grounding of obligation in prior objective statuses, relative statuses of superior and subordinate, calling forth command on the part of the superior and obedience on the part of the subordinate as the consequent appropriate practical acts or normative attitudes. One is the idea that the status of superior, having the right to command, to oblige those commanded to obey, has not only normative consequences, but also normative conditions of application. This is the idea that being a superior is a normative status that one must in some sense deserve, for instance, through the fact of service or of an attitude of benevolence. This goes beyond the simple idea that authority is more than mere power, for that distinction can be made entirely on the side of the consequences of application of the concept superior. It's the claim that the circumstances of application of that concept are themselves normative in character. One has to have done well by the subordinates through performing a service, or at least have an attitude of wishing them well, that is, benevolence towards them. Their second idea is the idea that the status of being a superior, in the sense of having a right or authority to impose obligations and command obedience, as opposed to the mere power to punish noncompliance, might be dependent on the attitudes of the subordinates, on their having agreed to or consented to, or otherwise in some way acknowledged that authority. The second idea is momentous, for it's the idea that the normatively significant status of having the authority to impose obligations, which according to the first idea also counts as a normative status in the sense that exhibiting it has normative conditions of desert, worth, or entitlement, that normative status is, or at least can be, attitude dependent. Pufendorf's invocation of consent, or elsewhere acknowledgement, by the subordinate as a condition of the superior's right to command marks a decisive change from traditional views. The idea that the normative statuses instituted by natural law might be dependent on normative attitudes is a distinctively modern one. Indeed, the core of Hegel's understanding of the transition from traditional to modern selves, norms, and societies, as laid out in his Spirit chapter, should be understood to consist in a shift in the relative priority of normative statuses and normative attitudes. The basic thought is that it's of the essence of traditional structures of normativity that normative statuses are conceived of as objective, in the sense that neither their content nor their binding force depends on anyone's normative attitudes. Those normative statuses set the standard for assessment of the propriety of attitudes. The law is what it is, independently of what anyone thinks about it, and one is obliged to acknowledge one's responsibility to its authority. The paradigmatic form of this traditional structure is what I've called the subordination obedience model of normativity. In its classic form, being a subordinate or a superior is an objective normative status, and normative subjects are supposed to, they're subject to a distinctive kind of criticism, including punishment if they do not, acknowledge those normative statuses by adopting practical attitudes of obedience and command. By contrast, it's distinctive of modernity to take normative statuses of authority and responsibility, entitlement and commitment, to be instituted by normative attitudes of acknowledging or attributing those statuses, attitudes of taking or treating someone in practice as authoritative or responsible, entitled or committed. While Hegel insists that this modern model expresses a genuine and important truth about the metaphysics of normativity, in the end he sees both the traditional and the modern models of normativity as one-sided. The first as hyper-objective and the second as hyper-subjective. Just as traditional accounts failed to acknowledge the authority of attitudes over statuses, the responsibility of statuses to attitudes that the moderns had discovered, even the most sophisticated version of the modern understanding, Kant's autonomy account, though it does also acknowledge the authority of statuses over attitudes, the responsibility of attitudes to statuses, which the tradition had appreciated, fails adequately to integrate the traditional and modern lines of thought. Hegel's own social recognitive metaphysics of normativity is what's required to give each its due. So I said I was going to look back at the tradition through the lens of what Hegel made of it. The main structure of that lens is this opposition between the traditional notion of the status dependence of normative attitudes and the transition to the modern notion of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, and to see how those different strands get pulled together in Hegel's account. The vocabulary I'm going to use to express these ideas is mine rather than Hegel's. He doesn't use the terms authority and responsibility. These are the terms I'm going to adopt to talk about what he discusses under the headings of independence and dependence, neither of which, he insists, can be properly understood independently of its relation to the other, both of which must be understood as themselves interdependent moments in a more complex structure. Though he uses these central logical metaphysical terms, independence and dependence, in many ways, I want to claim that the normative uses, paraphrasable in terms of authority and responsibility, are fundamental. They're the home language game of Hegel's talk about independence and dependence. And Hegel doesn't use the terms that I've already introduced of normative status and normative attitudes. These are the terms I'm adopting to talk about what he discusses under the headings of what things are in themselves, an sich sein, and what they are for themselves or for others, für sich sein, when these terms are applied on the normative side of subjects. This strategy of understanding his independence and dependence in terms of authority and responsibility, and in itself and for itself or for another, in terms of normative statuses and normative attitudes, lies at the core of the semantic reading of this portion of the phenomenology that I'm offering. And I'm going to use these to pull together and unify the various vocabularies that all the different modern and early modern figures I'm talking about use. In this connection, it's illuminating to consider, to begin with, the natural law tradition distinction, the distinction within the natural law tradition between intellectualists and voluntarists. Intellectualists, paradigmatically among the Catholic theologians, Aquinas, held that the authoritativeness of commands issued by superiors to subordinates, expressions of the attitudes of those superiors, answered to or depended upon reasons rooted in the same objective natures that determined their relative primacy as superiors or subordinates. Within this tradition, even God, with the objective status of being superior to all, is understood as constrained in the laws he lays down by the demands of reason concerning the objective good of creatures with the natures that he has endowed them with. By contrast, theological voluntarists, such as William of Ockham, reject the constraint on God's normative attitudes by reasons rooted in objective natures, as codified in Aquinas' distinction between his absolute and his ordained power. What makes something right or obligatory, what institutes those normative statuses, is just God's normative attitudes towards them, his approval or his commands. Those attitudes are not understood as constrained by reasons stemming from any antecedent objective normative statuses. It's his will alone, which I'm talking about in terms of normative attitudes, that institutes normative statuses of obligation and permission. God could, if he so chose, Occam says, have made murder and adultery right, though he didn't in fact do so. Divine command theorists understand the obligations, normative statuses obliging the adoption of normative attitudes of obedience, of us subordinates because inferiors, as instituted by divine attitudes, expressed in commands, acts of will, even if the framework of relative normative statuses of superior subordinate is understood as objective in the sense of attitude independent. Where intellectualists see all attitudes as answering to attitude-independent statuses, voluntarist natural lawyers do not see the status-instituting attitudes of superiors as themselves constrained to acknowledge prior statuses. The voluntarists can be thought of as holding a variant of the traditional subordination-obedience model. But compared to the still more traditional intellectualists, they substantially inflate the significance of attitudes relative to statuses. In this sense, theological voluntarism in the Catholic natural law tradition represents the first stirrings of the attitude dependence of normative statuses that would burst into full bloom among the early Protestant natural lawyers. This was the thin leading edge of the wedge of modernity. Luther and Calvin, for instance, were theological voluntarists. Samuel Pufendorf is in many ways the clearest spokesman for the distinctively modern approach that gives explanatory priority to normative attitudes over normative statuses in its Metaphysics of Normativity. For he understands normative statuses as instituted by normative attitudes across the board. On his picture, an antecedent, independent, and self-sufficient natural world has normative significances imposed on it by human attitudes. For him, there were no normative statuses, no obligation or authority, before people adopted attitudes of taking or treating each other as obliged or authoritative. His generic term for normative statuses is moral entities. And he says, quote, "We may define our moral entities to be certain modes superadded to natural things and motions by understanding beings, chiefly for the guiding and tempering of the freedom of voluntary actions." For him, we create these moral entities just as God creates the natural ones. He says, quote, "As the original way of producing natural entities is by creation, so the manner of framing moral entities cannot be better expressed than by the term imposition. For these are added at the pleasure of intelligent creatures to beings already perfect in the natural sense, and consequently obtain their whole existence from the determination of their authors." This realm of normative significance is the ancestor of Hegel's Geist. Understanding it and how we create it is a principal task of philosophy. Pufendorf again, "Our business is to declare how, chiefly for the direction of the will, certain kind of attributes have been imposed on natural things and motions. And these attributes are called moral entities, because the manners and actions of men are judged and tempered with relation to them, and do hence assume a face and habit different from the horrid stupidity of dumb creation. The most important of these moral entities are laws and obligations. He says that norm is called a law that's a decree by which a superior obliges a subject to conform his actions to what he prescribes." End of the quote. So Pufendorf has an early modern version of the traditional subordination obedience model, but transposed so that normative statuses are seen as imposed by normative attitudes. For the dependence of the normative statuses of obligation on the part of subordinates on the attitudes of superiors is for him balanced by the reciprocal dependence of the status of the superior as one who has a right to impose obligations by his attitudes on the attitudes of consent or acknowledgement of just authority by the subordinate. In this way, the relative primacy statuses of superior-subordinate are themselves understood as, in the end, attitude-dependent. Here, I think, we find an important ancestor of Hegel's view of normative statuses as instituted, imposed, or synthesized by reciprocal practical recognitive attitudes. Seeing statuses, Pufendorf's moral entities, as instituted by the practices and practical attitudes of human beings brings them back down to earth. It shows them up as our products. So I've been pointing to two rising tides of thought in early modern thinking about the metaphysics of normativity. First is the idea that normative statuses are instituted, Pufendorf says imposed or imputed, by human normative attitudes. I emphasized here the transformation of the voluntarist version of the traditional metaphysics of subordination and obedience by the thought that the status of superiors as having the authority to institute obligations by their attitudes itself depends on its acknowledgement by, or at least the consent of, subordinates, as in Pufendorf and again in Locke. The second idea is the allied naturalization of normativity, consequent upon seeing normative statuses as instituted by human normative attitudes, that's evident already in Grotius. There's a third element in the emerging modern account of the metaphysics of normativity that's common to the natural law tradition and to the British sentimentalists, in spite of the difference of orientation marked by the law versus love slogan. In this abbreviated presentation in the material, I've left out my discussion of the British sentimentality tradition, but I'll mention sort of what I draw from that as I go along. Grotius put at the center of his theory the idea that norms are instituted to solve a problem that arises from the essentially social character of human beings. He says, quote, "Amongst the things peculiar to man is his desire of society, that is, a certain inclination to live with those of his own kind, not in any manner whatsoever, but peaceably, and in a community regulated according to the best of his understanding. This sociability, or this care of maintaining society in a manner conformable to the light of human understanding, is the fountain of right, so called." End of Grotius. Natural law for him is natural in stemming from this feature of human nature, its sociality. On the one hand, we're sociable creatures, and on the other, conflicts will inevitably arise and must accordingly be managed. That's why we institute the obligations and rights that articulate the normative spheres of property, contract, and merited punishment. I've been claiming that the natural law and sentimentalist traditions are alike in understanding normative statuses as natural products of human social attitudes. These three dimensions, the attitude dependence of normative statuses, naturalism, and the social practical character of the institution of norms by attitudes, mark them as distinctively modern approaches to the metaphysics of normativity, contrasting with traditional objective forms of the subordination obedience model. And I've been appealing to Pufendorf to emphasize the distinctively modern idea that normative statuses are dependent on normative attitudes. This thought transforms the subordination obedience model of normativity, enforcing a distinction between traditional and modern forms of it. In effect, I rehearsed three stages in the development of this model. The most traditional proponents of the subordination obedience model are intellectualist, theological, natural law theorists, such as Aquinas. They understand the attitudes of superiors, in the form of the commands they issue, as instituting laws and so obligations. But the status of being a superior, in the sense of having the authority to issue binding commands, is understood as objective, in the sense of being an attitude-independent matter of metaphysical fact, determined by what kinds there are. Further, intellectualists see all attitudes, including the commands of superiors, as answering for their correctness to attitude-independent statuses rooted in the actual kinds, which provide reasons for some attitudes rather than for others. Reasons binding even on God's ordained power. Though not on his absolute power, he could have created other natures, which then would have constrained him by other reasons. A crucial intermediate step on the way to modernity is represented by the voluntarist theological natural law theorists, such as Occam, who don't see the status instituting attitudes of superiors as themselves constrained to acknowledge the bindingness of prior statuses or objective reasons deriving from the natural kinds there actually are. A third stage is then achieved by the Pufendorfian idea of normative statuses as imposed by attitudes, not only from above, in the direction from superiors to subordinates, but also from below, in the converse direction. Now here again, for the purposes of getting through this, I'm going to skip a discussion of the perfectionist self-government tradition that's rooted in Montaigne, but once again I'll say what I want to get from it. The most proximal source of Kant's way of understanding the attitude dependence of normative statuses is Rousseau. In addition to this filiation, Rousseau is independently important to Hegel, who takes from him some ideas that Kant does not take up. In particular, one cannot read Hegel's discussion of the subordination obedience model of normativity in terms of the allegory of masters and servant, lordship and bondage, without thinking of the startling second sentence of Rousseau's social contract, which it's evidently intended to explicate. Rousseau says, quote, "One thinks himself the master of others and still remains a greater servant than they." Rousseau performs a remarkable synthesis of the natural law tradition, which introduces the idea of attitude dependence of normative statuses in the form of a distinctively modern version of the traditional subordination obedience model, synthesizing that with the perfectionist tradition of self-governance, which includes commitment to the status dependence of normative attitudes as part of its essential core. Rousseau radicalizes the modern idea of the attitude dependence of normative statuses that had emerged within the natural law tradition by combining it in an unexpected and unprecedented way with the idea of self-governance, which had been thought of by its earlier champions in terms of a capacity to shape one's attitudes to one's understanding of antecedently constituted objective norms that was central to the perfectionist tradition. He performed this synthesis by placing all these conceptions in the framework of a radically new conception of freedom, which serves as a kind of meta-norm for Rousseau. And it's this idea that inspired Kant and Hegel and came to define German idealism generally. The slogan for Rousseau's reconceptualization is, his remark, quote, "Obedience to a law one has prescribed for oneself is freedom," end of the quote. He endorses this model both in the individual case of the I, where, for instance, Émile's education is to bring him up to be the kind of self who can resolutely commit himself and feel himself self-consciously free in such self-binding. And Rousseau also applies it in the social case of the we, where the essence of the social contract is for us to be free in obeying laws that we have laid down for ourselves as expressing the volonté générale. In the context of my rehearsal of prior approaches to normativity, a number of features of Rousseau's view stand out. First, freedom, a normative status, is understood as instituted by the normative attitudes expressed by practical acts of command and obedience. This is a purely modern view of the wholly attitude-dependent status of norms. It radicalizes the strand of thought we've seen developed from voluntaristic forms of medieval natural law theory through its early modern Protestant and secular heirs. It's a form, though, of the subordination obedience model of normativity. Second, freedom is also here clearly a norm of self-governance. Rousseau's remarkable synthesis of these disparate ideas shows up clearly if we lay these points alongside three other observations. First, the self-governance tradition emphasizes the status dependence of normative attitudes, the objective authority of attitude-independent reasons based in the ontological nature of things. That is exactly the converse of Rousseau's pure attitude dependence view. Yet Rousseau has managed to synthesize these seemingly incompatible lines of thought. Second, the subordination obedience model of normativity grounds the normative status of obligation on the essentially asymmetric relation between the normative statuses of superior and subordinate. By contrast, Rousseau's version resembles the perfectionist self-government tradition, which acknowledges no such asymmetry. For this perfectionist tradition, all of us humans, like God himself, are in the same situation of striving to conform to the reasons that are inherent in the natures of things. Rousseau achieves this symmetry by identifying the commanding superior normative subject, whose attitudes institute obligations by laying down laws, with the obedient subordinate normative subject, the appropriateness of whose attitudes is assessed according to those obligations. The subordination obedience model looks completely different if it's the same normative subject instituting statuses by attitudes of commanding and obeying. Further, Rousseau transmutes the overarching goal driving the process of perfecting our capacity to govern our own attitudes by our appreciation of objective reasons into the form of a master norm, freedom, to which obligation, the leading normative status according to the natural lawyer's order of conceptual explanation, is subordinated. In his lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel says, quote, "The principle of freedom emerges in Rousseau, and this furnishes the transition to the Kantian philosophy." On the way of combining it with new conceptions of reason and self-consciousness, Kant takes Rousseau's idea about freedom and develops it into a fine-grained account. One of the things Kant appreciates about Rousseau's idea is that it presents what Isaiah Berlin would later call a positive conception of freedom, rather than a negative one. Crudely put, it's a conception of freedom as the freedom to do something rather than as freedom from some kind of constraint. It's an active rather than a passive conception of freedom. According to the negative conception of freedom, obeying a command, being obliged to act one way rather than another, is a paradigm of unfreedom. It's just the sort of constraint that freedom contrasts with. Rousseau's idea is that it's otherwise with self-command. Governance by one's own attitudes, by commitments one endorses and embraces, is not the sort of constraint that even the negative conception of freedom forbids. A second feature of Rousseau's idea of freedom that Kant focuses on is that it's an essentially normative conception of freedom. What makes an act free is the kind of authority one is acknowledging in performing it, what one is acknowledging responsibility to, namely, in each case, one's own attitudes. According to this conception, freedom does not contrast with acting from necessity. It consists in acting from practical necessity, that is, from the normative necessity of obligations that we've instituted by our own attitudes of endorsement, according to commitments or responsibilities that we have ourselves undertaken. Kant gets from Rousseau the idea of thinking about positive freedom in deontic normative terms, by contrast to the empiricist's negative conception of freedom understood in alethic modal terms of possibility and necessity. Acting freely is construed as acting autonomously, in the sense of producing performances that express attitudes of obedience to obligations that one has instituted by one's own attitudes. Positive freedom in this sense is not lack of constraint. It's a special kind of constraint, constraint by norms. Normative constraint, in the sense that matters here, is practical necessity understood in terms of self-imposed obligations. By understanding the practical species of necessity in terms of autonomy, Kant is in effect transforming Rousseau's definition of freedom into a criterion of demarcation of the normative. I'll say that again. Kant transforms Rousseau's definition of freedom into a criterion of demarcation of the normative. Only statuses that result from exercises of our freedom, in the sense of autonomy, count for Kant as genuinely normative statuses. Statuses we have not ourselves instituted, those imposed by others, paradigmatically by superiors commanding distinct subordinates, show up by contrast as exercises of power. As heteronymous, they do not have genuinely obliging normative force. Turning Rousseau's definition of freedom into a criterion of demarcation for a distinctive sense of normative bindingness is a big conceptual move. It provides an account of the distinction Pufendorf had already put in place between the causal force of physical entities and the normative force of moral entities, which he understood as imposed by the attitudes of normative subjects. In place of the empiricist opposition of constraint and no constraint, Kant puts the opposition between two kinds of constraint, alethic and deontic, heteronymous and autonomous. That normative force, the bindingness of genuinely normative statuses of obligation, Kant understands as essentially mediated by and dependent on the attitudes of the ones who are bound by those statuses. Kant understands us as living, moving, and having our being in a normative space, a space of obligations and commitments. Rousseau gave him the clue as to how to distinguish that realm of norms from the realm of nature, which can then be seen to include the obedience of subordinates non-normatively compelled by the threat of sanctions from superiors. The normative realm, for Kant, is by definition the realm of freedom. Appealing to the symmetric attitudes involved in obedience to self-imposed obligations, to define what it is for a status to count as a genuinely normative status, using autonomy as a criterion of demarcation for the normative, has consequences for the structure of those statuses, in particular for the structure of their attitude dependence. To be a normative subject, that is to be able to act autonomously, and so to be the subject of obligations that are genuinely normatively binding, that is, are genuinely normative statuses, is itself to have a normative status. It is, first, to have the authority to make oneself responsible by an act or attitude of endorsing, whether doxastically in judging or practically in willing, that is, endorsing a practical maxim. This is the authority to undertake and acknowledge commitments. It's the normative capacity, in the deontic sense of authority, not the alethic sense of possibility. It's the normative capacity, the authority, to commit ourselves, to bind ourselves in the normative sense of obliging ourselves to do something, rather than the ability to become responsible for doing in the empiricist sense of making something happen. This is a status, authority, in virtue of which one's attitudes, expressed in acts of command and endorsement, institute statuses, obligations, commitments, responsibilities. In fact, this is exactly the constellation of statuses and attitudes that constitute the status of superior according to the old subordination obedience model. It is, second, to have the responsibility to fulfill obligations that have been instituted by one's own attitudes. This is a status, responsibility, in virtue of which one's attitudes, expressed in acts of obedient conduct, acknowledge one's attitude dependence obligations, or normative statuses. This is exactly the constellation of statuses and attitudes that constitute the status of a subordinate, according to the original subordination obedience model. Rousseau's idea was that freedom is the status that results when the players, be the organic individuals or communities, of these roles of superior and subordinate coincide. By transmuting this definition of freedom into a criterion of demarcation of normative statuses and attitudes, that is, by using it as the structure of a new metaphysics of normativity, Kant requires that the roles, not just the players, the roles of superior and subordinate coincide. Hegel uses the terminology of independence and dependence in a normative sense to talk about authority and responsibility. So in his terms, the fundamental Kantian notion of normativity essentially involves moments of both independence and dependence. If and insofar as the basic form of normativity is what Kant takes it to be, namely having the authority to make oneself responsible to commitments one has oneself undertaken, that constellation of independence and dependence is more basic conceptually than either the authority, the independence, or the responsibility, the dependence, for neither can be understood apart from their complementary relations to each other. This notion of the basic Kantian normative status being the authority to make oneself responsible and what Hegel makes of it, that's going to be the subject of my next lecture. The structure I want to emphasize here is the way in which Kant has synthesized the modern idea of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, rooted in the voluntarist wing of the natural law tradition, with the pre-modern idea of the status dependence of normative attitudes, rooted in the intellectualist wing of the natural law tradition. On the Kantian story, it's entirely up to the normative subject what explicit commitments she undertakes. She's autonomous, free in the sense that Rousseau identifies. Which determinate conceptual norms she binds herself by, which particular judgments or intentions she endorses, are for her alone to decide. Her attitudes institute normative statuses, commitments and responsibilities that bind her by conceptually articulated norms. As a normative subject, a knower and an agent, she has the authority to undertake those responsibilities by adopting attitudes acknowledging them. That without such normative attitudes of acknowledging and attributing commitments, there are no commitments or responsibilities, no normative statuses, is the fundamental modern insight into the metaphysics of normativity, according to Hegel. What's a reason for what is a matter of the relation between contentful statuses that is not at all dependent on the attitudes of those whose statuses they are, or indeed of any attitudes at all. Having undertaken one commitment obliges one to acknowledge others, those that are its rational consequences. That one is obliged to have reasons for one's commitments is a responsibility that is not an attitude-dependent feature of theoretical or practical experience. Not only that one is subject to normative assessment as to the goodness of one's reasons for the commitments one has undertaken, but also what would count as fulfilling that responsibility are not attitude-dependent in the way in which what ground-level commitments one undertakes is attitude-dependent. In exercising one's authority to undertake responsibilities by adopting attitudes, one also subjects one's attitudes to assessment as to whether they suitably acknowledge those responsibilities and what they attitude-independently entail. It's the business of transcendental philosophy to teach us not only about the attitude dependence of normative statuses in the sense of autonomy, freedom as constraint by norms we've imposed by our own attitudes, but also to teach us about how this autonomy is necessarily exercised within a context of normative statuses that knowers and agents are rationally obliged to acknowledge in their attitudes. Now I want to talk about Hegel. Hegel admires and applauds this synthesis of what each of the pre-modern and modern traditions got right: the structural reciprocity of normative attitudes and statuses, according to which each is both authoritative over and responsible to the other. Here, he thinks, Kant plants the seeds of a postmodern overcoming of the opposition between the one-sided traditional exclusive emphasis on objectivity, the authority of status over attitude, on the one hand, and the one-sided modern exclusive emphasis on subjectivity, the authority of attitude over status, on the other. He rejects, however, the particular structure Kant has put forward to achieve this synthesis. For Kant's understanding of the relation between the two dimensions of authority and responsibility relating normative statuses and attitudes is hylomorphic. The normative statuses that rationally demand acknowledging attitudes on the part of knowers and agents, which Kant sees as commitments implicit in the undertaking or acknowledging of any particular determinate commitments, the endorsement of any judgments or rules for acting, are for Kant those that articulate the framework that makes empirical knowledge and practical intentional action possible in the first place. What they express, those statuses, those attitude-independent statuses, is features of the conceptual form that particular conceptual contents and their applications must exhibit. The normative statuses that normative attitudes are dependent upon are those for Kant that articulate the form of normative attitudes. The normative attitudes that normative statuses are dependent on are those that determine the content of those statuses. My talk of Kant's categorical concepts as making explicit features of the framework within which empirical description and explanation are conducted on the theoretical side, and determinate exercises of intentional agency are conducted on the practical side, is a way of indicating this form-articulating expressive role that's played by those categorical concepts, and the synthetic judgments knowable a priori to which they give rise. From Kant's point of view, the pre-modern tradition was right about the form of normativity. It provides substantial normative statuses that our normative attitudes are unconditionally obliged to answer to. And for Kant, the moderns were right about the content of normativity. Determinately contentful normative statuses are instituted by the normative attitudes of those subject to assessment according to them. As I read him, Hegel endorses the aspiration to give both the status dependence of normative attitudes and the attitude dependence of normative statuses their due, and to see these reciprocal relations of authority and responsibility between normative statuses and normative attitudes as two sides of one coin, inseparably intertwined and jointly constitutive of the very concepts of normative status and normative attitude. But he does not think that understanding them as related, as articulating respectively the form and the content of normativity, as Kant does justice to their actual relationships. Here, as elsewhere, he thinks that distinguishing the essential elements of this constellation of metaconceptual dimensions of reciprocal authority and responsibility on the hylomorphic model of form and content is an unsatisfactory, because ultimately dualistic, construal. He sees it as a paradigmatic strategy of Verstand. The proper conception utilizing his preferred metaconcept structured as Vernunft, requires moving from the model of individual autonomy to the social model of reciprocal recognition. The point of my rehearsal of some of the large-scale strands of thought shaping the early modern metaphysics of normativity has been to make it possible to show how Hegel weaves them together in an altogether original way. His account of normative statuses as instituted by the proper social constellation of recognitive normative attitudes is the fifth model we need to consider. It's both the successor and the product of the four that I've already mentioned, namely the traditional subordination obedience model, the modern subordination obedience model, epitomized by the Grotian tradition of natural law, the perfectionist empiricist sentimentalist tradition, and the radically modern Kant-Rousseau autonomy model. According to Hegel's model, normative statuses are instituted by special sorts of normative attitudes when those attitudes exhibit a distinctive kind of social structure. The kind of normative attitudes, a structurally suitable constellation of which are capable of instituting genuine normative attitudes, are attitudes of what he calls recognition, Anerkennung. Recognizing something is recognizing someone, taking or treating someone as a normative subject, that is, as the subject of normative statuses, and so, on this model, as both subject and object of normative attitudes. The distinctive social structure of recognitive normative attitudes that Hegel takes to institute normative statuses is reciprocal or mutual, gegenseitig recognition. Recognitive attitudes attribute normative statuses. General recognition is attributing a kind of normative metastatus, the status of being a normative subject. Since according to this model, this metastatus is instituted by recognitive attitudes when they're symmetric, when one is recognized by someone one recognizes in turn, it's a normative status that can in principle be exhibited only by those who both adopt normative recognitive attitudes and have such attitudes adopted toward them. So, to have normative statuses, one must be both subject and object of normative recognitive attitudes. This last point is particularly important. Hegel takes over from Kant a normative understanding of what it is to be a self. Selves just are normative subjects, whatever exhibits normative statuses. The idea is that to be a self is to be self-conscious. A self-consciousness, that idea, then shows up for both Kant and Hegel as the claim that the normative attitudes of the self play an essential role in constituting or instituting normative statuses, and so normative selfhood. For Kant, to be a self is to be a judger and an agent. According to his normative understanding of empirical consciousness and agency, this just is to be the subject of epistemic and practical commitments. And to be committed is to adopt normative attitudes, to acknowledge commitments, to endorse judgeable contents and practical maxims. What makes one committed is that one takes oneself to be committed, for Kant. Adopting those explicit attitudes of acknowledgement turns out to involve implicitly acknowledging the authority of various other commitments and responsibilities, including for Kant the framework articulating categorical ones and those articulating the determinate contents to which one has made oneself responsible by endorsing particular judgments and practical maxims. On this account, the phrase self-conscious selves is redundant. Selves as such are self-conscious because of the role attitudes play in instituting normative statuses. One big difference between Kant's and Hegel's versions of this line of thought is that Kant takes individual, self-regarding normative attitudes to be immediately constitutive of normative statuses. By contrast, on Hegel's account, no single individual's attitudes institute normative statuses, and no single attitude is immediately constitutive of any normative status. The attitudes of multiple normative subjects, each playing the role both of recognizer and recognized, subject and object of normative attitudes, are required to institute normative statuses, including the metastatus of being a self or subject of normative statuses and attitudes. Any particular individual recognitive attitude is constitutive of a normative status only when mediated by a corresponding recognitive attitude on the part of the one to whom it's addressed. For Hegel, this normative achievement, being a subject of normative statuses, is a social achievement. For him, normative statuses are social statuses. And self-consciousness is equally a social achievement and a social status. It's not something that happens between the ears of an individual. It is, we could say, the product of a recognitive conversation. Hegel's is a paradigmatically modern view, according to his own understanding of modernity, in that it acknowledges the attitude dependence of normative statuses. Like Pufendorf's notion of imposition, or Kant's autonomy view, or what I've been calling the perfectionist, empiricist, sentimentalist Metaphysics of Normativity, it understands normative statuses as instituted by normative attitudes. But like the traditional subordination obedience model, and like the modern Grotian version that Pufendorf develops, and unlike Kant's, it sees the institution of statuses by attitudes as an essentially social affair. Rousseau's understanding of freedom as self-legislation, which Kant is developing, can take a social subject. When the collective volonté générale institutes obligations binding on all citizens of the community constituted thereby, but it is, like Kant's, in taking the communal attitudes then to be both self-regarding, reflexive rather than symmetric, and immediately constitutive of genuinely binding normative statuses. Hegel combines his version of the essentially modern idea that normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes with the Kantian normative conception of selfhood as essentially self-conscious to arrive at a social theory of self-conscious selves as subjects of both attitudes and statuses. The subordination obedience model essentially incorporates an asymmetric social relation. One party commands and one obeys. And recognition, too, is at base an asymmetric social relation. It has a recognizing subject and a recognized object. But it's the essence of Hegel's Metaphysics of Normativity that the recognitive attitudes in question be symmetric and reciprocal, in that sense mutual. The roles of recognizer and recognized, being the subject and being the object of recognitive attitudes, those roles are distinct, and the individuals playing those roles are distinct. But all parties must play both roles with respect to each other for their normative attitudes to institute normative statuses. Since no single recognitive attitude is immediately constitutive of a normative status, the asymmetry of recognition relations does not make the imposition of normative statuses by attitudes asymmetric. Kant and Rousseau achieved symmetry within a conception that is recognizably a version of the legislating-obeying model by adopting a reflexivity strategy, that is, identifying the commanding with the commanded. Hegel does so, instead, by adopting a symmetry strategy, understanding the key social normative relation to be one where both the subjects standing in that social recognitive relation play both roles. So this is one of my fundamental oppositions. Everybody before Rousseau and Kant had looked to reflexivity to overcome the asymmetry, and Hegel looks to symmetry. Both metaphysical models can be seen as versions of the idea that normative attitudes of command and obedience between individuals standing in subordination relations can institute statuses of obligation that are genuinely normative statuses only if they're intelligible as having the structure of self-government. The autonomy model applies that idea by requiring that the instituting attitudes be reflexive. The recognition model applies that idea by requiring the instituting attitudes to be symmetric. The dyadic symmetry requirement can be thought of as a species of the monadic reflexivity requirement in which the self-governing unit that is the subject both of the instituting attitudes and the instituted statuses is no longer an individual I, but a social we, forged by symmetric recognition. According to this new, essentially social conception of normative selfhood, the self-constituting self-conscious subject of both normative attitudes and normative statuses they institute is what Hegel calls the I that is we and the we that is I. So Hegel presents a social theory at once of the relation between normative attitudes and normative statuses, of the nature of selves as normative subjects of such attitudes and statuses, of self-consciousness understood in terms of the relations between attitudes, statuses, and selves, and of freedom according to the self-governance tradition as integral to self-consciousness instituting normative statuses by its attitudes. On this account, communities are synthesized along with essentially self-conscious normative subjects by their recognitive attitudes and practices. Another way in which Hegel's account of the social institution of normative statuses by reciprocal recognitive normative attitudes, another way in which that develops themes central to the tradition of early modern metaphysics of normativity, is that his social story of the origin of normative statuses in normative attitudes is also a way of, in a broad sense, naturalizing them. This point is particularly evident if we contrast his story with Kant's, in which the normative properties essential to discursivity and rationality, such as the Verbindlichkeit of concepts and the Gültigkeit of judgments, are accorded a somewhat ethereal, noumenal, ultimately sui generis character. Empirical activity, both cognitive and practical, presupposes the normative character of concept use, that judging and willing are kinds of endorsement, are the exercise of distinctive kinds of authority, the undertaking of characteristic species of commitment. Hegel's construal of normative statuses as social statuses, as instituted by social practices and processes of recognition, removes the realm of norm from the hidden interior of individual self-consciousness and brings it into the public light of day. Hegel says, a display of what is one's own in the element of universality, where it becomes and should become the affair of everyone. End of the quote. The social move at the same time brings normativity down to earth from the transcendental heaven in which Kant had located it. It's recognizably a development in the long tradition that opens the gradual modern secularization of normativity. The naturalism in question is not predicated on the possibility of reduction of the normative products of social interaction to processes intelligible from the standpoint of the natural sciences. New things happen at the social level, specifically the normative realm of Geist, and so discursivity itself is instituted. Hegel's naturalism is more akin to that of the later Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, like Kant and Hegel, sees its normativity as a defining characteristic of intentionality. He's interested in the way intentional states, such as believing something, meaning something, desiring or intending something, as it were, reach out to various possible states of affairs and sort them into those that are and those that are not in accord with the contents of the intentional state. It's a characteristic quote from the Investigations. Someone says to me, show the children a game. I teach them gambling with dice, and the other says, I didn't mean that kind of game. Must the exclusion of the game with dice have come before his mind when he gave me the order? End of the quote. The thought is that this retrospective claim about what was meant, intended, ordered, or requested is quite correct. He didn't mean that kind of game. We might find ourselves puzzled about this normative significance, as about how a signpost can show us the right way to go. Wittgenstein aims to demystify the normativity that articulates discursive content by showing it as a feature of the natural history of beings like us, who produce and consume such normative significances through our practical attitudes and our social practices. If we can fully understand how we come to learn to engage in practices of being guided by, responding appropriately to signposts and requests, then the idea that something metaphysically spooky or or supernatural is going on is dispelled. Wittgenstein is, in Hugh Price's sense, a subject naturalist rather than an object naturalist. That is, he's a naturalist about our implicitly normative social practices and attitudes, of Pufendorfian imputation and imposition, rather than being concerned with how to fit normative significances and normative statuses into a physicalist ontology. Wittgenstein's deep concern, only one of whose expressions is what have come to be known as the rule-following considerations, is to understand how, in the context of ongoing social practices, our actual attitudes and performances can bring into play genuine, determinately contentful normative statuses, norms, commitments, entitlements, and reasons, to which our attitudes then answer normatively. Statuses that normatively govern our performances in the sense of providing standards of assessment of their correctness. Wittgenstein, too, sees a genealogical challenge to the intelligibility of the genuine bindingness of conceptual norms. He appreciates and teaches us to appreciate the radical contingency of the norms implicit in our practices, their counterfactual sensitivity to accidental features of our embodiment, the vagaries of the process by which the norms developed through prior applications, the way they've responded to the presence of collateral commitments that might have little rational bearing on them. Once we understand the variety of the dependence of the contents of our conceptual norms on factors that do not provide reasons for applying them one way rather than another, all the true subjunctive conditionals specifying that if these contingencies had been different, the content of our concepts would have been different, how, he asks, are we to make sense of those concepts as nonetheless genuinely normatively binding on us? These discursive norms articulate our rationality by articulating what's a reason for what. What becomes of the idea that some applications of concept in judgment and intention rationally commit us to others, rationally bind our further attitudes? This, I'm claiming, is the later Wittgenstein's master question. Hegel's answer to this question is his account of the relation between the normative force of recognitive attitudes that are actually adopted in contingent circumstances and the determinate conceptual contents that are conferred on them by that particular history of use. Those contents determine what one is actually committing oneself to by applying those concepts. That is, what normative status one is adopting by taking up a certain attitude, by endorsing a particular content in a context. So the account of the relation of reciprocal dependence between normative attitudes and normative statuses that takes us beyond the one-sided traditional emphasis on the status dependence of normative attitudes and the one-sided modern emphasis on the attitude dependence of normative statuses is part and parcel of the story about the relation between normative force and conceptual content. The key to Hegel's story, as I see it, is that only a certain kind of process of incorporating contingencies of actual applications of concepts can confer determinate content on it. The reconstrual of determinateness this insight requires is the core of the move from the standpoint of Verstand to Vernunft. And I want to close by giving a very quick sketch of how I think this goes in Hegel. Hegel's answer to Wittgenstein's question depends not only on the social recognitive strand put into play in the self-consciousness chapter, but also crucially on the historical strand that he introduced to us for the first time in the introduction and which is developed further in the Reason and Spirit chapters. The retrospective rational reconstruction of a tradition of concept applications is the process that, as he says, gives contingency the form of necessity. Viewed prospectively, the particularity and contingency of individual attitudes shows up, the sense in which they're explicable in terms of other attitudes, both prior and collateral, without reference to governing normative statuses. Viewed retrospectively, the necessity codified in norms as statuses shows up, the sense in which individual attitudes are normatively governed by universals implicit in the tradition to which they answer for their correctness. Seeing these dual prospective and retrospective perspectives as two sides of one coin, as indissolubly linked aspects of one rational process by which conceptual content is determined, is what allows Hegel to do justice both to the attitude dependence of normative statuses and the status dependence of normative attitudes. The structure of authority and responsibility it embodies turns out to exhibit the structure of reciprocal recognition. We have to consider recognition in this historical form in order fully to appreciate Hegel's version of the modern idea that normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes. According to his story, the retrospective rational reconstruction of particular contingently adopted attitudes, the process that turns a past into a tradition, a history, institutes the representational dimension of conceptual content. It's what gives us access to the idea of noumena behind the phenomena, of a way things are in themselves, that provides a standard for assessing the correctness of the various ways they show up for consciousness. It's what makes sense of discursive attitudes as answering to attitude-transcendent norms, to conceptual contents that determine what's really a reason for what, as opposed to what consciousness at various points in the process takes to be a reason for what. Hegel elaborates this historical structure in his discussion of intentional agency in the Reason chapter, and returns to it at the end of the Spirit chapter in his treatment of the final historically self-conscious form of reciprocal recognition in his allegory of confession and forgiveness. Filling in the details of this story is the task of the rest of my book, and of Hegel's book. For Hegel, the form of reason's march through history is the telling of a distinctive kind of retrospective, rationally reconstructive story, what he calls eine Erinnerung, that recounts a tradition that's expressively progressive in showing up as the gradual emergence into explicitness of determinately contentful conceptual norms and commitments that become visible as having been all along implicit. In this lecture, I've told a story of this sort, encompassing some of the major philosophical landmarks of early modern thinking about the metaphysics of normativity. The standpoint from which I look back on and reconstruct this tradition is Hegel's own social recognitive metaphysics of normativity, and especially his diagnosis of modernity as having at its theoretical core the rise of subjectivity in the form of an appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses. In my story, Kant plays a decisive role in raising the stakes for a metaphysics of normativity. For before him, even for his hero Rousseau, normativity mattered for practical philosophy, for moral, social, and political thought. Appreciating for the first time the essentially normative significance of concept use generally, Kant broadens the significance of normativity to take in the whole discursive realm. The rationally reconstructed story of the antecedents of Hegel's view that I've told here is mine, not Hegel's, but I've been guided throughout by where I take it Hegel got to, rather than by his own rational reconstructions. Hegel's the first to see that not only do philosophical theories of the metaphysics of normativity, that is, what normativity is for philosophical consciousness, have a history, but that what normativity is in itself also changes, develops, and has a history. And that's so precisely because of the dimension of the attitude dependence of norms that is, according to him, the great discovery of modernity. Normativity is for Hegel, as for Kant, the fabric of self-consciousness. And as essentially self-conscious creatures, what we are in ourselves depends on what we are for ourselves. As we'll see, the Spirit chapter of the Phenomenology presents a history of the metaphysics of normativity in this ontological sense. On the side of intellectual history, what shows up in the first instance is the shift from traditional subordination obedience models of normativity to modern self-governance models, comprising both Kantian species in terms of individual autonomy and Hegelian species in terms of social recognition. And the theoretical shift from traditional exclusive emphasis on the status dependence of normative attitudes to modern exclusive emphasis on the attitude dependence of normative statuses. But intertwined in tandem with this development of structural ways of understanding the metaphysics of normativity is a corresponding development in the phenomenon understood. At the center of the rise of modernity is a development of the structure of social recognitive attitude and practices that articulate the normative discursive realm of Geist. My topic here has been the intellectual antecedents of Hegel's social recognitive theory of the metaphysics of normativity. Principal moments in my rehearsal begin with the development of traditional subordination obedience accounts into distinctively modern versions within the natural law tradition. From the point of view of Hegel's overarching understanding of modernity, in terms of the dawning appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, the voluntarist strand in this tradition of particular significance. And we saw here too the idea of the progressive idea that a status, superiority, that includes having attitudes, commands, that can institute statuses, is itself a normative status, not only in its consequences, but its conditions. And the social functional origin of and rationale for norms is emphasized by everyone downstream from Grotius. The combination of thinking of normative statuses as instituted by normative attitudes and an appreciation of the social setting in which the process of imposition takes place are motives for the growing secularizing and naturalizing of normativity. In the same naturalist, empiricist tradition, an understanding of normativity in terms of self-governance develops. And Kant broadens the significance of all these considerations by seeing normativity as not just of moral significance in practical philosophy, but as the fundamental structure of consciousness and self-consciousness, Überhaupt. These traditions are synthesized in Rousseau and Kant in the form of a reflexive, and only so, symmetric model of freedom and normativity, generally as social or individual autonomy. Hegel's symmetric social recognitive metaphysics of normativity pulls together all these strands of thought. And it's in the self-consciousness chapter we get our first glimpse of Hegel's picture of the realm of discursive norms or universals, Geist, as the product of the practical attitudes of particular creatures who become essentially self-conscious individual normative subjects by subjecting their attitudes to assessment according to the norms the recognitive community has historically instituted by its attitudes.